Lord, the light of your love is shining in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us. Set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me. Shine on me. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze. Set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow. Flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning and welcome to Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith. I'm the minister for the Marquette Church of Christ here in the Central UP. Thank you so much for being here today. Last week, we started something a little bit different. We started going through the Gospel of Matthew. Said before, we're going from the beginning to the end. We might have a couple of months where we're doing something different. Brian Poe is going to be coming onto the program here before too long. We're going to do a couple of episodes together before then as well. But then we'll continue this after that as well. So in spite of those interruptions, we are going to go from the beginning to the end of Matthew's Gospel. So we'll be there for a while. So we started last week in chapter 1, verse 1. We got through verse 17. So we're continuing on today in the text, starting with Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. We're talking about the birth of Jesus Christ specifically. Now, when we talk about the birth of Jesus Christ, here's something interesting. There are 4 gospel accounts, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Only 2 of those gospel accounts include the story, the narrative of Jesus' birth. You could make an argument that John sort of has something in there like that. Normally, the beginning of his book is referred to as more of a prologue rather than a birth narrative or a birth story. That's where you have, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And eventually down in verse 14 it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So it talks about Jesus coming into the world, but it doesn't tell the story of his birth. There are only 2 gospel accounts that do that. Mark doesn't, but Matthew and Luke do. Matthew and Luke tell the story of the birth of Jesus Christ. Now Luke is fascinating because Luke tells the story from the perspective of Mary. And I think that's typically how we view that story. We tend to view the story through the lens of Mary, this woman who is caught off guard by this unexpected surprise of being the mother of Christ. That's interesting, and that's worthy of study and worthy of reflection. But Matthew takes a different approach. Matthew takes the approach of Joseph, this man who was caught in a situation that he didn't mean to be caught in, right? So Matthew tells the story from Joseph's perspective, and I think that's really fascinating. So we're going to get to the text in just a moment. First, I want to tell you about Grandpa Herman. So Grandpa Herman was one of these guys. I'm convinced that all of us have somebody in our family like this. He loves to tell stories, and you can't, half the stories that he tells, he probably wasn't even a part of, and they're probably not even true. But he loves to tell his stories, right? So they were at a family reunion, and Grandpa Herman had this whole group of people gathered together around this table to listen to his next story. And so he started telling the story about how he grew up in England, which nobody thought he had grown up in England, but he grew up in England evidently. And he tells about the time that the Martians landed on the Earth, and how these big rockets came down from the skies and plummeted to the Earth's surface. And when they landed, people gathered around them to see what was going to happen, and you had these creatures with tentacles coming out of off of their chin, crawling out of the capsules, and then they start building the capsules up, and then they these capsules would rise up on these big tripod steel legs, and then these huge robotic creatures would be controlled by the Martians from the inside, and they were going through the English countryside, razing villages with their heat rays and heat guns and everything else. And then eventually, the Martians, because they're from Mars, they didn't have viruses and bacteria there on Mars like we do here on Earth. And so when the Martians started to get colds and the flu and everything else, well, then they died off. And then, of course, the government covered it up and acted like it never happened. Okay, so there's Grandpa Herman's story of the Martian invasion that failed. Now, obviously, the people sitting around the table are looking at him like he's crazy because, obviously that's fiction, right? By the way, if you didn't know it already, that's the plot to War of the Worlds, the book written back in the 1890s. Most people, I think, are pretty good about discerning and separating fact from fiction. That which is true and real from that which is not true, from unreality. Most of the time, we're pretty good at doing that. But when God intervenes in the world, that which is impossible shifts into the realm of possibility. And it can make that discernment a little more difficult. Okay, so here's another story for you. This is during the period of the Iron Age, around the 1000s period in Eastern Europe. There is this huge army that had gathered together to march against this city. And really, it wasn't just one army. 5 kings had decided to form an alliance, and they combined their armies together to march against this city. This city wasn't huge in and of itself, but they were a little concerned because the city had made its own alliance with this group of refugees that had earned sort of a reputation for their military prowess, but really it was a group of refugees. And so just to be on the safe side, this 5-nation army came together and they were just going to just squash them. They didn't want any chance of there being a legitimate threat to their nation. So they march against this small city. And, this small city, they had allied themselves with this group of refugees. So they send a scout to go tell the refugees what are going on. And they tell them, hey, we're under attack. Can you help us out? You agreed to be our allies. And so they agree. So this band of refugees, they march all through the night. And they actually get to the encampment outside the city. They get there right as day breaks. And so they launched this offensive against this gigantic army. And it totally caught them off guard. They didn't expect that. They were going to siege the city and probably have some long, drawn-out siege or some sort of battle that involved them going into the city. They didn't expect to be fought against like that. And so they were caught in the back foot, and this small city and the refugees, they were pretty successful. So this big army starts to retreat. And as they retreat, the goal is they're going to retreat, regroup, and then they'll be able to mount up pretty easily a pretty formidable counteroffensive. And, this small group of people, they don't want that to happen. So they're trying to chase them down, right? But as they're chasing them down, it's getting a little late in the day. And the fear is, well, it's going to become nighttime, and then we're really going to lose them. It's going to be easy for them to get away. They're going to be able to regroup. They're going to be able to, produce some sort of counteroffensive. And so this is a real problem. So a couple things happen at this point. As this big army is retreating, a storm starts to form over the horizon. And it happens to form just over this retreating army. Not over the small city, not over the refugees, but just over this big army. And it's a pretty severe storm. In fact, hail starts to fall from the sky. Big enough stones to eliminate people in that army. And the story goes that actually there were more people that died because of that storm than died in the initial attack. So that happens. But not just that. This refugee commander, the guy in charge of this group, he looks at the sun and he says, hey, sun, stop. Don't move for a second, will you? And so the sun, of course, it stops. The sun and the moon don't move for 24 hours. And that gives the refugees enough time to catch up with this giant army, to eliminate them, to capture and execute their kings, and, they win. Now, that can't happen, right? I mean, that's impossible, right? That's not how the world works. You can't just look at the sun and say, hey, sun, stop in the sky. That, our whole solar system, you think about what would have to happen to the earth and the sun and the moon and everything else. Like, how does that happen? But in Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 through 28, that's exactly the story that you get. You have these 5 nations who had heard about the Israelites, and they had heard about the conquests that they've had over these military powers that they really shouldn't have been able to win against. And they're a little bit afraid, and so they decide to march against this city Gibeon, the Gibeonites, after the Israelites made a pact with them, an alliance pact. So they start to march against the Gibeonites, but then the Israelites are called on to help. They march all through the night, and sure enough, they launch this surprise attack at dawn. Catch them on the back foot. They start to retreat. Hailstorm forms, wipes out most of the army. And then Joshua, the commander of the Israelites, looks at the sun and says, stop. The sun and the moon don't move for 24 hours. And the Israelites catch up to this huge army, eliminate the army, eliminate its leaders. Should have been impossible, right? Here's another story for you. So this was a long time ago in northern Arabia. There was a religious nomad, and he had this group of followers with him. And this was pretty common during that period. You had, you had a wise man of some sort in the East. Some of them were known as gurus. But here in the West, nomads of various religious affiliation, and this person had this following, this group of people who were assistants of sorts, students of sorts, and they decided eventually, to make a permanent settlement. They had been traveling along everywhere else, and they said, well, now, we're such a huge group of people now, we've got to settle down somewhere. And so eventually they decide to make this settlement on the side of this river basin. And so they go to this river basin and they start preparing an area of land. They're chopping down trees, not just to clear out the land, but to gather building materials for their shelter, right? And so this guy has an axe, and he's taking this axe and he's whacking this tree with it, hitting the tree over and over and over and over again. And finally, on one of his backswings, the metal head of the axe goes flying off. It goes flying off behind him, and he loses it, and it falls into the river. So, now he's in real trouble because this iron axe head is going to sink down to the bottom of the river, and it's not the shallowest of rivers. And so he lost it. But not only that, the problem was that it wasn't his axe. He had actually borrowed it from somebody else, and so he was a little worried about, well, I'm sorry, I broke your axe, and he's going to be liable for that. So he goes to the leader of this nomadic group, and he tells him what's going on. And so this religious leader, he goes up to the river. He says, all right, well, where did you lose it? Where did it fall in? Over there? Okay. So obviously, he takes a stick and he throws it in a general direction into the water where the axe head fell. And then, of course, the axe head goes and floats up to the top of the river. And then they retrieve the axe head, this heavy, dense metal axe head. That's impossible, right? That's not how the world works, right? 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, see, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there. And he answered, go. Then one of them said, be pleased to go with your servants. And he answered, I will go. So he went with them. And when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees, but as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, "Alas, my master, it is borrowed." Then the man of God said, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, "Take it up." So he reached out his hand and took it. Impossible, right? That's not the way the world works, right? There was a girl named Gabriella. Gabriella grew up in a small town, and she grew up in a church-going family. Nice girl. She was 15 years old when this other family moved into town, and it was one of these towns, too, where everybody knew everybody else's business, that kind of place. So she grew up in a small town. She was 15 years old, and this other family moved into town. And there was this 15-year-old boy named Zach that was part of this family that moves in. And well, Zach had a pretty similar background. Also grew up in another small town just some distance away, and church-going family. And he was a good guy. So they started spending some time together, talking with each other, and eventually Gabriella goes to her parents and says, I would really like to date Zach. See, some of you are going to make fun of me too, because whether you're part of an older generation or a younger generation, I know we have different ways of talking about this. I think I heard my father say one time, he said, are you going together? I said, what is going together? What do you mean? What is that? Okay, so Gabriella wanted to date Zach. I don't know if that's part of the modern diction or not, but that's the way I'm going to describe it. So Gabriella wanted to date Zach and told her parents as much. Said, I'd really like to date Zach, and they were a little concerned because, she's 15 years old, and I don't know what your thoughts are about this, but these particular parents, they were a little concerned. That's a little young and a little immature at that stage. And yeah, he's a nice enough guy, but you're 15, right? So they eventually said, let's just wait. Let's hang on for a bit. Maybe if you're 16, 17 and you're still interested and still friends, let's see where it goes from there. But for now, no. And Gabriella and Zach weren't too crazy about that response, especially Gabriella. Gabriella decided that she was going to take it upon herself to go and spend time with Zach, whether her parents wanted her to or not, and whether her parents knew about it or not. So she was sneaking out of the house, spending time with Zach. One of the times, her parents catch her, by the way, so they know that she's been doing this off and on. And they rebuke her for it, and they tell her, that's not such a great idea. Please don't do that. And then a few weeks go by. Gabriella doesn't feel too good. It's during the school year. She misses a day of school, doesn't feel too good, sick to her stomach a little bit. And then the next day comes and she still doesn't feel too great. Then the next day comes, she still doesn't feel too great. Eventually mom says, all right, well, we gotta go to the doctor. It's not just a quick 24-hour bug. So takes her to the doctor, and sure enough, doctor comes back and pregnancy test came back positive. And Gabriella, of course, says, I don't know how this happened. I've got no idea. We never did anything. Nothing happened. And her parents, somewhat understandably, they're worried. They're concerned. They're a little disappointed. They're a little embarrassed. And most of all, they didn't believe her. When she says things like nothing happened, or I have no idea how this, I don't know. They don't believe her. Because that's not the way that the world works, right? It doesn't just happen, right? Right? Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, Before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. By the middle of the first century, at the time that Matthew is writing his gospel, Jesus' identity was under heavy scrutiny, particularly by Jewish leaders who, many of the Jewish leaders, and we see this all throughout the New Testament, they were skeptical about who Jesus was. They were skeptical about some of the things that Jesus came to say, some of the things he did, about his crucifixion, resurrection. A lot of these things drew a lot of ire and a lot of questions from the Jewish community. And especially when it comes to the birth of Christ. Remember last week, Matthew starts off with a genealogy in order to prove the credibility of Jesus' background, because that was a big question of his credentials as Messiah. Is he qualified to do this? And you know that the rumors had started to spread, right? I heard that Mary was pregnant before she even got married. I heard that, Jesus was probably born out of sin, right? The rumors had started to spread. It was an absolute scandal. Or it would have been. The Sadducees, for their part of the Jewish leadership class, the Sadducees pretty much all but rejected any notion of anything that hinted at miraculous activity. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in miraculous things that seemed to contradict the regular order of the world. They were so certain about their perception of the world that it was true and correct. The Jews, the Jewish people, they wanted a Messiah. But there were certain elements about Jesus' identity, there were certain elements about his past that people had a really hard time wrapping their heads around. So here's Matthew's point in all of this. He says, look, if Joseph, who really has more to lose than any of you, right? If Joseph can accept it, if Joseph can live with the suspicious circumstances, if Joseph can live with the rumors and the whispers, can't you? I know it seems impossible, but when God, and we see this time and time again throughout Scripture, when God intervenes in the world and in human history, that which once seems impossible, it shifts into the realm of possibility. There are some people today that are listening to this, some of you maybe, who haven't accepted Christ because there's something about the Bible, there's something about Jesus, there's something about faith that you just can't wrap your head around. And I would go as far as to say that there are probably a number of Christians that might be struggling with their faith right now because the claims of Scripture, the claims of Christianity, especially when it comes to these miraculous things, sometimes are hard to understand. They're hard to explain. They're hard to defend. Now, I want to be really clear about this. I'm not asking you to reject the laws of physics. I'm not asking you to reject reality. I'm asking you to believe in a God who created the laws of physics, who created the universe, and often in ways that only he could, worked within it. And this activity, this miraculous activity, is testified to in dozens of stories. These things were witnessed by thousands of people to bring about the salvation of humanity, of you and of me. Matthew is an invitation. It really is. It's an invitation, but it's not an invitation to believe the impossible. Mary, actually, in Luke's account, in Luke chapter 1, verse 37, the angel Gabriel is telling Mary how she's going to conceive and bear a son, even though she's not married to Joseph yet. And she says, well, how is that going to happen? You know, Mary knows how the world works, right? And she says, well, how is that going to be possible? And Gabriel says, for nothing will be impossible with God. The invitation of Matthew is not to believe the impossible, it's to believe the possible. Not even that. It's to believe the truth. The truth, as we're told, like in verse 21, that she will bear a son. You shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. It's not just possible. It's the truth. And that truth makes all the difference in the world. I want to thank you for your time and attention today. I hope that in some way this lesson was helpful and beneficial to you. Before we go, I want to go over some of the resources that we offer to our listeners. First of all, we have a Bible correspondence course. This is a 7-part workbook series. It's published by the World Bible School. What we do, if you want to participate, is we send you the first one up there in the top left, A Way of Life. That's book 1. So we start you off by sending you the first workbook in the series, and it guides you and walks you through this study. And it has you answer some questions along the way. And what you do is you send that back to us. We'll give you some feedback, and then we'll send you the next one along with it as well, and until you finish through the whole 7-part series. If you want to do that, you don't have a Bible, or if you don't have a Bible anyway, we also have Bibles available to you totally free of charge. They are hardcover English Standard Version. It's the same translation we use here on the show, typically, and again, they're available to you totally free of charge. The contact information for the church is up on the screen as well. You can reach us by mail at P.O. Box 372. That is in Marquette, zip code 49855. You can find a lot of this information on letthebiblespeak.net. Not .com, that's a different ministry, different website. But if you go to letthebiblespeak.net, you can find our information. You can also, by the way, find information about some of the local churches in the area. If you're watching this and you're in the UP, go to the local churches tab. You're welcome to join any one of us at our regular worship times. We also publish these episodes on Spotify and on Podbean in podcast form, and also on YouTube. Just be sure to search Let the Bible Speak UP on those platforms, and you can find us. I want to thank you so much for joining me on the program today. I hope you have a wonderful week. May God bless you in all that you do.
The Father's glory blaze, Spirit blaze, set our hearts on fire. Flow, river flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be